Barack Obama was widely considered the most brilliant orator in modern political history. Yet he found himself entirely incapable of completing a single sentence. JD, Vance confronted him with a document authored by Obama's own staff. This document was an internal secret, never intended to see the light of day beyond the White House walls. For the very first time in his public life, the former president was rendered absolutely speechless. Initially, Obama attempted to frame the gathering. He spoke about the shared motivations that bring members of both political parties into public service. He sat with the relaxed posture of a gracious dinner host. He leaned back comfortably. One of his hands rested gently on the table, while the other draped over the arm of his chair. His physical presence radiated the effortless comfort of a seasoned leader. He had occupied rooms of power far more frequently than anyone sitting across from him. His vocal projection was masterclass. His voice commanded the room without ever requiring him to raise it. It reached the farthest back wall without any apparent strain. He had spent his entire life perfecting this specific vocal register. He commanded it the way a master musician naturally commands a musical key. He proclaimed that they were gathered because of a shared belief that government could be a positive force. He emphasized that this was a deeply American belief rather than a partisan one. He then admitted that, like everyone else, he had spent his career operating imperfectly. Following the word "and," he executed a calculated pause. This pause acted as a rhetorical open door for his audience. It was a deliberate invitation to witness his feigned vulnerability and willingness to acknowledge his own flaws. In the second row, a reporter instinctively leaned forward by a half-inch. This was the natural human reaction when Barack Obama paused. You leaned in to absorb the gravity. He stated he was trying to live up to his core beliefs. He claimed to always welcome an honest accounting of both successes and failures, calling it vital for the health of democracy. He stated he welcomed this very conversation. Obama had just characterized his career as merely imperfect. However, the vice president arrived armed with a ledger detailing 7 of those specific imperfections. Vance had meticulously gathered dates, exact quotations, and the stark reality of what actually occurred. Crucially, he possessed one damning email originating from within Obama's own White House. It was a communication his staff desperately wanted buried forever. Vance was prepared for battle. His sleeves were rolled tightly up to his forearms. His glasses rested sharply on the bridge of his nose. A thick stack of documents sat untouched on the table before him. He remained perfectly still in his seat. His hands were placed flat on the table, palms down, devoid of any nervous motion. When he finally broke his silence, his volume was incredibly low. The microphone had to actively amplify his quiet tone. "Mr. President, I want to start by telling you something you might not expect," Vance stated. He lifted his gaze directly from his papers to lock eyes with Obama. This unflinching eye contact was a powerful statement in itself. Historically, most individuals who engaged with Barack Obama diverted their eyes to their notes, the cameras, or the table. But Vance stared right through him. "I voted for you in 2008, Vance revealed. Obama's chin tilted upward by a mere fraction. His eyebrows twitched a single degree, a micro-expression only captured by the front-row cameras. Vance painted a picture of his difficult upbringing. He was a struggling kid from Middletown, Ohio. His mother was constantly cycling in and out of drug rehabilitation. His grandmother, whom he called Mama, raised him on a meager $11 an hour. They lived in a rundown house with severely stained carpets and a broken screen door. Vance recounted watching Obama stand on a stage in Grant Park, boldly promising hope and change. "And I believed you," Vance confessed. He paused. It was not a calculated, theatrical Obama pause. It was the heavy silence of a man reflecting on a painful memory. He noted that many forgotten citizens in Middletown had also believed those soaring words. These were disillusioned people who had completely abandoned the voting process. Obama had successfully brought them back into the fold through the sheer power of his rhetoric. Vance firmly placed his hand on his stack of evidence. He declared he was sitting there today precisely because of those empty words. He flipped open the first page. He cited the 15th of June, 2009. He quoted Obama's famous pledge, "If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. If you like your healthcare plan, you can keep your healthcare plan." Vance read the quote at a deliberate, agonizingly slow pace. He wasn't mocking the president's tone. Instead, he borrowed the architectural structure of Obama's speech patterns. He adopted the spaciousness and the strategic pauses. It was like a man trying on a borrowed suit, only to expose how poorly it actually fit. After reading the quote, he gently set the paper down. When Vance spoke his next sentence, his voice violently shifted. It returned to his own flat, unmusical Ohio cadence. It was the cold, clinical voice of a man reading a damning receipt. He delivered the grim reality. 5 million Americans received sudden cancellation notices. He noted that PolitiFact, an organization completely unaffiliated with Republicans or conservative blogs, officially crowned that promise the lie of the year in 2013. Vance calmly placed the first page aside and retrieved the second. A chilling ritual began to manifest in the hearing room. The methodical extraction of paper, the stark contrast between the two reading voices, and the deliberate placement of documents on the wood table created an undeniable rhythm. The transparent visibility of this process only magnified its devastating power. By the time Vance reached the third page, the entire room anticipated the incoming strike before he even articulated it. This anticipation didn't soften the blow. It made the impact infinitely deeper. He cited the 21st of January, 2009, Obama's very first full day in office. He quoted the president's solemn vow to operate the most transparent administration in history. Vance delivered this quote with that borrowed, slow presidential rhythm. He gave the hollow words ample room to breathe. Then his voice snapped back to its tight, unforgiving bass line. He revealed the dark truth. Obama's administration prosecuted far more whistleblowers using the Espionage Act than every single previous American administration combined. The Department of Justice executed a secret seizure of 2 months' worth of private phone records belonging to the Associated Press. The FBI officially designated Fox News journalist James Rosen as a criminal co-conspirator. His only crime was asking questions, which was the fundamental definition of his profession. A female reporter sitting in the press gallery completely froze. Her fingers hovered motionless over her keyboard, suspended mid-keystroke, unable to resume typing. He moved to February 2009. He quoted the promise that Obama would not rest until every American seeking employment could find a job. Vance instantly countered with the bleak reality of flat, forgotten Middletown, Ohio. He spoke of the Armco steel plant. It was the lifeblood where his mother and half the town had worked. It was a place where a young man could graduate high school on a Friday and secure a union job with full benefits by Monday morning. That very plant permanently shut down its final production line during Obama's tenure. Simultaneously, opioid prescriptions ravaging Butler County tripled between the years of 2009 and 2015. The reliable jobs vanished, rapidly replaced by highly addictive pills. The narcotics were delivered by the exact same trucks, traveling on the exact same roads, directly to the exact same struggling houses. Vance aggressively noted that the president certainly did not rest. Instead, he simply delivered multiple beautiful speeches. Vance refused to give the room a moment to process the grief. He forcefully turned to the next page, March 2009, a quote demanding no more ignoring the law simply because it proved inconvenient, declaring that is not who we are. Vance dropped the hammer. Operation Fast and Furious. The Obama Justice Department intentionally facilitated the smuggling of 2,000 firearms across the southern border. These weapons were handed directly to dangerous Mexican drug cartels under the guise of tracking them. The government inevitably lost track of the deadly cargo. One of those specific cartel firearms was later recovered at a bloody crime scene. It was the location where U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was tragically shot and killed on sovereign American soil. When the United States Congress launched an investigation into the fatal disaster, Attorney General Eric Holder stubbornly refused to hand over critical documents. Holder shielded himself by invoking executive privilege. Consequently, Congress held the Attorney General in contempt via a rare bipartisan vote. Over 14 years later, Brian Terry's grieving mother still lacked a complete explanation of how her son was allowed to die. In the audience, an older man wearing a VFW cap dug his hand fiercely into his own knee. His knuckles turned bright white from the sheer tension. His eyes locked dead on Vance. January 2009. A definitive promise to permanently close the detention facility located at Guantanamo Bay. Vance destroyed the promise with two flat words. It is open. He offered zero elaboration. He simply turned to the next page. January 2009. A pledge that no member of the administration would forge policy driven by ideology rather than hard evidence. Vance highlighted the devastating IRS targeting scandal. Obama's political appointees weaponized the IRS to aggressively target conservative grassroots organizations. These groups were merely applying for standard tax-exempt status. Any organization featuring the words Tea Party, Patriot, or 912 inches, their legal titles were systematically singled out. They faced crippling delays and highly intrusive, unwarranted questioning. Lois Lerner, the primary official responsible for the corruption, was dragged before Congress. She cowardly invoked her Fifth Amendment right and point-blank refused to answer a single question regarding her actions. Vance clutched the final page for a fraction of a second longer than the previous documents. His thumb unconsciously traced the sharp edge of the paper. It was the involuntary gesture of a man forced to hold something deeply unpleasant. September 2014, Obama proudly stated that Americans do not leave their people behind, claiming it was central to their national identity. Vance's voice dropped to a devastating whisper. 40 veterans in Phoenix died agonizing deaths while trapped on a secret medical waiting list. The corrupt hospital deliberately maintained this hidden ledger alongside the official public one. This allowed the government to fraudulently report shorter wait times to the public. A massive federal audit eventually uncovered the horror. 57,000 vulnerable veterans had properly enrolled and requested vital medical appointments, yet never received a single one. 1,600 heroes were forced to wait well over 90 days for basic care. Vance set the horrifying document down on the table. He locked eyes with the former president, reminding him that his mother's own neighbors relied on that very VA system. These were honorable men who fought bravely in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. They returned home believing their grateful country would finally take care of them. Instead, they languished in sterile waiting rooms for months on end. All the while, the hospital actively lied about the duration of their neglect. Vance meticulously aligned all 7 pages across the wooden desk. They formed a stark row of white rectangles against the dark surface. 7 grand promises sat on the left, 7 brutal realities sat on the right. The arrangement stretched across the table, visually representing a tragic timeline. It was not a measure of dates, but a measure of profound distance. It showcased the massive chasm between what the politician said and what he actually did. Vance delivered the fatal summary. Obama promised hope, but Middletown received an influx of heroin. Obama promised change, but the bustling factories transformed into decaying, empty structures surrounded by weed-infested parking lots. Obama claimed he would not rest. Vance countered that his mother's neglected neighbors were the ones entirely devoid of rest. They spent years desperately waiting for the promised change, while the president was busy traveling the country delivering eloquent speeches about it. Obama finally leaned into the table. His body language aggressively morphed from a passive host into a defensive advocate. He abandoned the backrest and moved squarely toward the microphone. He threw his physical weight toward the confrontation. When he responded, his voice strategically dropped half a register. He sought that unique commanding depth he always utilized to remind an audience why they had surrendered the nuclear codes and 8 years of power to him. He addressed the vice president directly, claiming he appreciated his candor and his willingness to share his personal tragic story. Then came the pause. The entire room instinctively leaned in once more. The reporter, the veteran in the cap, and a nearby staffer all drifted forward by a half inch. This was the undeniable gravity that Obama's silences artificially manufactured. Obama launched into a philosophical defense. He argued that the act of governing is brutally difficult, labeling it the hardest task in existence. He insisted that the vast distance between a campaign promise and an enacted policy is not an indicator of a moral failure or a corrupt character. Rather, he claimed it was simply the inherent width of the democratic process itself. He described it as a messy space entirely filled by unavoidable compromise, complex legislation, and harsh realities. He boldly asserted that absolutely no president in the entire history of the American Republic had ever delivered on every single promise. He let the rhythmic repetition build momentum, making every subsequent word feel heavier than the previous one. He listed the legends, not Lincoln, not Roosevelt, not Reagan, and finally, not himself. Obama pivoted, stating the ultimate historical question is not whether every individual promise was strictly kept. The true measure, he argued, is whether the overall direction of the country was correct. He asked whether the long arc of progress was continually bending toward justice, regardless of how slow or imperfect that bend might be. He abruptly straightened his spine in his chair. This physical straightening acted as its own powerful form of punctuation. He forcefully defended his concrete legacy. He cited the 20 million citizens who acquired health insurance for the very first time. He highlighted pulling the global economy back from the terrifying precipice of a second Great Depression. He championed the controversial Iran agreement, claiming it successfully prevented a nuclear armed state without costing a single American life in combat. He fiercely declared he would put that specific record up against any modern administration in history. Following the phrase modern history, he unleashed a massive 3-second pause. It was a masterful, classically calibrated Obama pause. It was the specific type of silence designed to make an entire crowd hold its collective breath, anticipating that the ensuing sentence would land with earth-shattering weight. Behind the witness table, a Democratic staffer sat up with renewed confidence. In the press row, a pen frantically resumed moving across paper. Vance calmly allowed the frantic scratching of the pen to cease. Then he unleashed his counterattack. Vance acknowledged the 20 million Americans who gained insurance, but immediately highlighted the 5 million Americans who had their existing plans violently stripped away. They lost the exact plans Obama swore they could keep. "You are counting the people you helped," Vance declared. He forcefully picked up one of the 7 scattered pages. "I am reading you the names of the people you lied to." The scratching pen abruptly halted. The confident Democratic staffer instantly slumped back down. Vance announced he had one final item to read. Reaching deep beneath his neat stack of papers, he extracted a singular, isolated page. The paper was printed on noticeably different stock. It featured a distinct header and prominently displayed a blue White House memorandum seal at the very top. It was the exact type of classified seal strictly reserved for internal documents, never meant for the glare of press conferences. Vance identified the document as a leaked internal communication from deep inside Obama's own White House. It was officially dated the 12th of September, 2013. This was a critical timeline, exactly 2 months prior to the disastrous launch of healthcare.gov. The memo was drafted by a senior policy advisor and sent directly to Obama's chief of staff. Vance meticulously adjusted his glasses. He began reading the text aloud at the exact methodical speed of a courtroom dictation. He allowed each individual clause to arrive completely separate from the last. He set the words down heavily onto the hearing table, like solid lead weights being dropped one by one onto a fragile scale, radically increasing the pressure with each drop. He read the advisor's warning. The specific keep your plan messaging was going to be a massive problem. The Department of Health and Human Services' internal projections clearly indicated that between 5 and 8 million citizens holding individual market policies were guaranteed to receive cancellation notices within the first 90 days of the rollout. Vance stopped reading and looked directly up at the former president. He reiterated the staggering figure, between 5 and 8 million. He drove the knife deeper, emphasizing that this specific catastrophic number was provided by Obama's very own staff. It wasn't fabricated by a hostile Republican committee. It wasn't an exaggerated estimate from a right-wing think tank. It was his own people, utilizing his own projections, presenting his own irrefutable number. Vance averted his eyes back to the leaked memo and resumed reading the internal warning. The advisor explicitly stated they needed to immediately cease using the false talking point entirely, or at the absolute minimum, inject a massive caveat. They suggested the President of the United States should substitute the word everyone with most people. The memo frantically warned that continuing to broadcast the original language created massive, undeniable, legal and political exposure for the administration. Vance set the explosive warning document down. He then picked up the documented response. It was a devastatingly brief, single-paragraph reply authored by the chief of staff. As Vance read it, his voice grew uncomfortably quiet. It sounded exactly like a man forced to read a horrific truth directly to the face of the man who authored it. He read the damning final verdict. The president had reviewed the warning. The president explicitly wanted to retain the false line exactly as it was written. The sole justification provided was that the fraudulent phrase polled exceptionally well, resting at a massive 78% favorability rating. Vance paused, letting the shockwave ripple. Then he delivered the final, fatal sentence of the response. The chief of staff concluded, "If we caveat it, we lose the message." The ambient hum of the fluorescent lights above the dais suddenly dominated the dead silence of the room. A stray pen casually rolled off the edge of a press table. It hit the carpeted floor with a tiny, round thud. For what seemed like an eternity, it was the single solitary movement within the paralyzed room. Vance slowly placed the page at the far end of his documented row. It served as the 8th white rectangle. It was the ultimate concluding document that perfectly explained the existence of all the others. Vance repeated the vile phrase once more. If we caveat it, we lose the message. He delivered it at the exact same pace, utilizing the exact same flat tone. He ensured it was perfectly captured for the official stenographer. He made sure it was eternally etched into the official transcript. He cemented a historical record that would survive long after every camera in the room finally powered down. Vance summarized the execution. He stated plainly that Obama's loyal staff explicitly told him the claim was a total falsehood. They didn't merely hint at it or gently suggest a change. They drafted a formal memorandum, stamped it with an official seal, and provided the exact mathematical damage, 5 to 8 million victims. They directly instructed him to stop lying. They even handed him a safe, truthful alternative: simply say most people. That single word, that one tiny caveat, was all that was required to remain honest. Vance dramatically removed his reading glasses. He laid them to rest on top of his stack of papers. He accused the president of ignoring the moral imperative. When faced with the truth, Obama's internal reaction was not a desire to fix the massive problem. His response wasn't a sudden realization that he owed the American public the absolute truth. His only response was a cold calculation. It polls at 78%, so keep the line. Vance stared relentlessly at Obama. He stripped away the final defense. He declared that the president absolutely did not misspeak. He did not accidentally oversimplify a highly complicated piece of healthcare policy. He was informed in explicit writing by his innermost circle, via a document bearing the presidential seal, that his core promise was a blatant lie. Yet, he intentionally chose to continue weaponizing that lie. He did so because a fabricated focus group statistic performed better than the harsh reality. Ultimately, 5 million innocent Americans suffered the loss of their vital health insurance simply because Barack Obama decided a polling percentage was vastly more important than a truthful caveat. Beneath the heavy wooden table, safely obscured from the camera lenses, Obama's left hand shifted down to his knee. His hand had been resting motionless on the tabletop since the hearing commenced. His right hand slowly drifted upward to his tie. He adjusted the knot by a barely perceptible quarter turn. It was the absolute first time all morning that the pristine former president required any sort of physical adjustment. This tiny, almost invisible adjustment was the ultimate tell. Barack Obama never fidgeted. He simply did not possess that nervous habit. His hand gripping his tie was not the action of a man genuinely concerned with straightening his polished appearance. It was the involuntary spasm of a man whose physical body had completely exhausted every possible method of remaining completely still under intense fire. His staff warned him the promise was fake. They handed him the catastrophic 5 to 8 million casualty count. His sociopathic response was to kill the caveat to save the message. He did not stumble. He consciously prioritized the poll number over basic truth. Through it all, Vance never once stood up. He remained deeply rooted in his chair. He purposefully avoided mimicking a theatrical courtroom lawyer delivering a bombastic closing argument. He projected himself simply as the kid from impoverished Middletown, Ohio. He was just a boy sitting directly across from the iconic president he had once believed in and voted for. Remaining seated kept him grounded at that exact humble level. Vance addressed him not with anger, but with a profound, terrifying disappointment. He openly conceded that Obama was unquestionably the greatest public speaker of his generation, and perhaps of any generation in history. When Obama spoke, the entire world stopped to listen. When Obama paused, Vance noted, while making a tiny gesture toward the dead air separating them, the people eagerly waited. When Obama weaponized the word hope, the masses blindly believed it. Vance acknowledged this was a very real, incredibly rare gift. He admitted he spent his youth mesmerized, actively listening to that very gift. Vance paused. This pause was not deployed for cheap theatrical effect. It was a pause born of deep personal memory. He recalled how he and his mother would huddle together to watch Obama's soaring speeches. They watched on a dilapidated television set equipped with a broken antenna. They physically had to hold the twisted metal at a highly specific angle just to maintain a clear picture. After watching one particular address, though, Vance couldn't recall exactly which one. Noting Obama was exceptional in all of them, his mother turned away from the screen. She uttered a prophetic sentence that permanently burned itself into Vance's memory. His mother observed, "That man talks so good, it makes you forget to check if he's telling the truth." Vance let his mother's devastating, simple wisdom hang heavily in the air. It sat invisibly on the table, right alongside the 7 damning pages and the explosive internal memo. Vance looked at the former president and delivered his final blow. I checked, Mr. President, Vance declared. He revealed his findings. 7 majestic promises resulted in 7 specific dates, which ultimately birthed 7 distinct lies. He found a staff memo that explicitly warned the president his biggest talking point was entirely fabricated. He found a calculated decision, authorized in Obama's own White House, cemented on his own official letterhead, to continuously repeat the lie simply because it polled well with focus groups. The betrayal was total. Obama preached hope, but the community was flooded with deadly heroin. Obama preached change, but their factories rotted into empty parking lots. Obama told them to keep their doctors, yet 5 million innocent people were violently stripped of their coverage. Obama preached unmatched transparency, yet he ruthlessly prosecuted the very whistleblowers attempting to force him to be transparent. Obama swore no one would be left behind, while 40 brave veterans literally died trapped on a fake waiting list. Vance solemnly noted that his mother did not live long enough to witness this historic hearing. She passed away in a forgotten house back in Middletown, Ohio. She died in the exact type of desperate neighborhood that Obama frequently exploited in his speeches, but completely abandoned in his actual policies. However, before she died, she imparted one final, vital piece of political advice to her son. It was the only political advice she ever gave him. She warned him to strictly watch what politicians actually do, rather than blindly listening to what they say. Vance repeated her mantra, "Watch what they do." He calmly picked up his folded glasses from atop the stack of evidence. He gently placed them onto the wooden table right next to the leaked memo. In the suffocating quiet of the room, the tiny metallic click of the glass's hinges echoed loudly. Vance stared deeply into the eyes of the man across from him. He stated he had finally watched exactly what Obama did, and what the president did was deliver the most magnificent, awe-inspiring speeches in the entire history of American politics, only to systematically shatter every single promise contained within them. Vance quietly folded his hands together. "That's all I have," he concluded. The committee chairman formally pivoted to President Obama, politely asking if he wished to offer a response to the devastating unmasking. Obama slowly opened his mouth. "I appreciate," he started, then he paused. It was technically the exact same measured length of time as every other calculated pause he had deployed throughout the morning. He held the exact same breath. He attempted to suspend the exact same rhetorical note. But this time, the magic was dead. In the second row, the dedicated female reporter, the one who had eagerly leaned forward into every single previous pause, her physical body magnetically drawn toward his voice, remained perfectly still. She refused to lean. The man sitting directly next to her also refused to move. The entire room, which had spent the entire morning eagerly leaning into Obama's manufactured silences like a captivated audience leaning into a beautiful symphony, suddenly stopped leaning. The duration of the pause was identical, but the substance of the pause was entirely different. A masterful pause contains a hidden power that actively pulls a room toward the speaker, but a pause completely devoid of substance allows the room to remain exactly where it is. Subconsciously, the physical bodies occupying the hearing room recognized the jarring difference long before their conscious minds could process the failure. Obama attempted to address the vice president's remarks, but stumbled into yet another, even longer pause. His eyes desperately darted away. He didn't look at Vance. He didn't look at the rolling cameras. His gaze drifted aimlessly to a random point in the middle distance. He stared at a space containing absolutely nothing. It was the terrified, blank stare of a man frantically attempting to construct a coherent sentence inside his own mind, only to discover the sentence was completely refusing to assemble. "I have always believed," he stammered, abruptly stopping mid-thought. He tried again, mumbling about public service, before hitting another rhetorical brick wall. His jaw visibly twitched. It was a microscopic, desperate movement. It was the physical struggle of a master orator secretly testing out words behind his teeth right before releasing them, only to realize for the very first time in his life that the words were entirely hollow and would not survive the test. Finally, he surrendered. "I stand by the work we did," he offered. It was a pathetic six-word defense. It came from a legendary figure who was famous for effortlessly delivering complex 45-minute addresses entirely without notes. This was the man who had beautifully eulogized complete strangers, driving an entire nation to tears. This was the orator who had historically weaponized the English language into an instrument so terrifyingly precise that a single breath could alter the emotional temperature of an entire room. Now, he was reduced to 6 empty words. Each word stumbled out of his mouth, separated by a massive, unintended space. The gaps were vastly wider than any dramatic space he had ever intentionally deployed. The tragic width of those silent spaces perfectly represented the massive distance between a confident man strategically choosing silence and a broken man who had genuinely run completely out of things to say. The video clip of the confrontation exploded online, shattering records by amassing 70 million views before the week concluded. It instantly became the most heavily watched entry in the entire congressional series. The sheer virality was driven by the presence of Obama. The public wasn't merely watching a standard politician lose a debate. They were witnessing a cultural phenomenon, the greatest living speaker discovering live on camera that his lifelong instrument was permanently broken and incapable of producing a single sound. A violently short 50-second version of the clip rapidly circulated the globe. It featured Vance reading the damning memo text, concluding with the infamous phrase, "If we caveat it, we lose the message." It immediately cut to Obama's horrified, empty face, completely drowning in a pause that held absolutely zero power. This brutal supercut dominated every major social media platform. It infected every single nation on earth where American political theater is consumed as entertainment, which effectively meant it reached every country on the planet. However, there was also a sprawling 1 6-minute uncut version. This version stretched from Vance's opening admission of voting for Obama in 2008 all the way to his final devastating conclusion. This longer video was not shared casually. It was the specific type of agonizing content that people chose to watch completely alone, late at night, safely behind closed doors. It forced the viewer to confront an incredibly painful internal question they were terrified to answer in the presence of others. Did they blindly believe the beautiful lies too? The political machine reacted instantly. The House Oversight Committee swiftly announced a massive formal inquiry investigating the 2013 internal communications surrounding the Affordable Care Act messaging. Aggressive subpoenas were immediately drafted and issued, demanding the release of all internal White House memoranda concerning the fraudulent Keep Your Plan messaging circulated between June and December of 2013. Technically, because Obama was no longer holding political office, he faced zero genuine legal jeopardy. The true damage was entirely political, and it moved with terrifying speed. 3 prominent, currently sitting Democratic politicians openly refused to appear at a scheduled public event where Obama was slated to speak. A 4th Democrat nervously attended, but made a point to be aggressively photographed sitting 4 completely empty seats away from the chair reserved for the former president. That singular photograph, featuring the stark, isolated, empty chair, organically became its own incredibly viral piece of damaging content. That very evening, a man named James sat alone in his quiet living room located in Akron, Ohio. He watched the grueling 1 6-minute uncut version of the hearing on a battered laptop precariously balanced on his damaged knee. James was a man who had proudly voted for Obama back in the historic 2008 election. He was only 22 years old at the time. It was the very first presidential election he was legally old enough to participate in. He vividly remembered standing in a long line inside a cramped middle school gymnasium, eagerly filling in the tiny bubble placed right next to Barack Obama's name. He voted for him because the charismatic man radiating from the television screen had masterfully deployed the word hope. James desperately needed to hear that exact word. He had grown up in an impoverished environment eerily similar to the struggles Vance had described facing in Middletown. James had bought completely into the soaring rhetoric of hope and change. He believed in those abstract concepts with the pure, unadulterated naivety of a young man who had not yet been crushed by the fine print of reality. He believed without a shred of hesitation, entirely unburdened by the grueling weight of a life that had not yet discovered the terrible, hidden costs of beautiful political promises. Fueled by that same belief, James had proudly enlisted in the military the very next year. He endured 2 brutal, grueling combat tours deployed to Afghanistan. Both agonizing tours were spent in the unforgiving Helmand province. It was notorious for being the most dangerous sector of the entire country, a hellscape featuring the absolute worst roads and the longest, most terrifying distances separating fortified military bases. James survived, but he returned completely broken. He suffered a painfully compressed disc deep in his lower back. He endured a permanent, maddening ringing echoing inside his left ear. The military doctors casually promised him the ringing might eventually fade, but it never did. He was handed a standard medical referral to the VA system, a process they assured him would take a mere 30 days to fully process. Instead, it dragged out for 14 agonizing months. James spent 14 months endlessly dialing phone numbers that would predictably ring 7 times before inevitably dumping him into a dead voicemail box. He spent 14 months trapped listening to the exact same 4-5-second loop of a Vivaldi classical music track acting as hold music. The trauma of the wait permanently ruined the classical piece for him. He would never be able to hear those notes again without feeling his blood pressure violently spike. He spent 14 long months absorbing empty promises that they would call him back, or that his critical file was actively being reviewed. He endured the highly specific, soul-crushing humiliation of being repeatedly informed by an automated, robotic voice that his call was supposedly very important to them and that he should simply continue to hold. Watching the video, James listened as Vance explicitly mentioned the 40 veterans who literally died while trapped on a falsified waiting list. Hearing this, James slowly looked down at his own scarred, trembling hands. These were the exact same hands that had gripped a combat rifle, fighting for a country, led by a commander-in-chief who had boldly stood on a massive stage and promised, with a booming voice that sounded as grand and holy as a cathedral, that absolutely no one would ever be left behind. James sat paralyzed with his own personal number, 14 grueling months. He wasn't one of the 40 dead, but he had lost 14 months of his life listening to maddening hold music. He lived with a shattered back that still aggressively seized up in agonizing pain every single time he merely attempted to bend over to tie his own shoes. James was technically one of the lucky ones who managed to physically survive the horrific waitlist. However, sitting in the dark, he realized he wasn't entirely sure his ability to believe in anything had survived the ordeal. He reached out and gently closed his laptop. He placed it quietly on the table, resting it next to a forgotten coffee mug whose contents had turned ice cold over an hour prior. James remained seated in the suffocating quiet of his lonely living room. It was a deeply specific type of quiet. It was the absolute, crushing quiet of a man who had once deeply, foolishly believed in something beautiful and was now completely and utterly finished with believing. Miles away, inside the vice president's office at the Naval Observatory, J.D. Vance sat in absolute silence. Before him rested a simple glass of water and a yellow legal pad. He picked up his pen and inscribed 2 words. Mama was right. His handwriting was unnaturally neat, a direct result of his grandmother rigorously forcing him to practice his letters every night. He felt no need to underline the phrase. He simply set the pen down, realizing those 2 words perfectly explained everything that had just occurred. Far away on Martha's Vineyard, Barack Obama sat isolated inside his sprawling study. Books stretched from the floor to the towering ceiling. He sat behind an expensive desk made of reclaimed wood, illuminated by a reading lamp that cost more than Mama's monthly mortgage. Despite the opulence, the former president was completely paralyzed. He was a writer at his core, a man who habitually processed the world and every major crisis by drafting text until the chaos finally made sense. Tonight, however, the sense refused to arrive. He stared blankly at his own yellow legal pad, intentionally avoiding a computer. The page remained empty. He sat immobilized, mirroring a master musician holding an instrument that had fallen out of tune. But the fatal problem was not the instrument. It was his ear. His ear absorbed a devastating truth he could never unhear. 7 broken promises, 7 dates, and 1 damning memo. Above all, he could not unhear an impoverished grandmother in Ohio observing, "That man talks so good it makes you forget to check if he's telling the truth." Someone had finally checked. They exposed the massive lies and the undeniable internal email. If we caveat it, we lose the message. He didn't misspeak. He chose a safe poll number over the truth.